The wind shrieks across the Montana wilderness. Inside an isolated, freezing cabin, a disgraced detective named Silas presses the cold steel of his pistol to his head. The fire is dying. His final letter is written, but a sound breaks the silence. Not the storm. A knock. He opens the door, not to a savior, but to a 7-year-old boy, Mason, clutching his baby sister. Their clothes are thin, frozen, and stained with blood and the smell of gunpowder. Behind them, a team of mercenaries is closing in. They aren't just hunting the children, they are hunting for what's hidden inside the boy's superhero backpack, a single hard drive that holds the truth. When the old K9 Ghost moves, he will not just bark, he will crash through a window. And when the boy moves, he will descend into total darkness to find their only miracle. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Whitefish, Montana, was being erased. The town itself, nestled precariously near the jagged granite teeth of Glacier National Park, had already surrendered, its cozy downtown lights and ski resort glow swallowed by the absolute tyranny of winter. But here, 12 miles up a winding, treacherous mountain road that was now impassable, the surrender was complete. A monster blizzard, the weather reports had called it, a pathetic understatement for the meteorological violence currently assaulting the small A-frame cabin. The wind did not howl. It shrieked with the multitonal, physics-defying voice of a banshee, a sound that seemed to carry the collective malice of every predator in the surrounding million acres of wilderness. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in horizontal sheets of pulverized ice, a solid wall of white that annihilated the very concepts of direction and distance. The world had shrunk to the 4 shaking walls of this isolated cabin, a tiny wooden box rattling in the fist of an angry, indifferent god. Inside this box, Silas Vane was methodically preparing to die. He sat in a worn, cracked leather armchair, the springs groaning a weary complaint beneath him. The only sound in the room that wasn't the storm or the occasional pop and hiss of the dying embers in the stone fireplace. Silas, at 40, looked a hard 50. He was a tall man, built on a broad, powerful frame designed for hauling gear and kicking down doors, but a lifetime of duty, followed by the catastrophic loss of it, had stooped his shoulders. A thick, grizzled beard, more salt than pepper, obscured the hard, angular lines of his jaw but couldn't hide the gaunt hollows in his cheeks, sculpted by months of alcohol and apathy. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, threadbare at the elbows, and jeans stained with grease and wood smoke. His eyes, once a sharp, intelligent ice blue that had analyzed crime scenes and read suspects with an unsettling predatory accuracy, were now the color of a frozen lake, dull, opaque, and lifeless. They stared into the necropolis of his past, seeing nothing of the frigid room around him. In his right hand, resting with a familiar, obscene weight on his thigh, was his old service pistol, a Sig Sauer P26. Its nitron-finished metal was cold, colder even than the biting draft that snaked relentlessly through the floorboards. This gun had been his partner for 15 years. It had represented honor, duty, and the thin, precarious line between order and chaos. Now, it represented the only door left open to him, a simple, mechanical solution to a complex, organic pain. On the rough-hewn pine table beside him, a single sheet of paper lay next to an almost empty bottle of cheap whiskey. A letter. A coward's explanation, he thought, to the people who no longer cared to listen. His ex-wife, Sarah, who had taken their daughter, Maya, and fled the blast radius of his disgrace. The department that had cast him out. The world that had watched him burn. The man responsible for the fire had a name. Julian Croft, a name that tasted like ash and bile in Silas's mouth. Croft, the sleek, smiling phantom of the tech world, a Seattle-based billionaire philanthropist whose name adorned libraries and hospitals, and who had, with the bloodless precision of a surgeon, disassembled Silas's life. Silas, once the most decorated K9 detective in the state, had gotten too close, pulling a thread that led from a low-level drug bust straight into Croft's sophisticated, multinational money-laundering empire. Croft hadn't needed a gun. He had used whispers, fabricated evidence, and deep, corrupt connections that ran like poison through the very justice system Silas had sworn to protect. Silas Vane wasn't just fired, he was disgraced, framed as the very thing he hunted, a dirty cop on the take. His honor was stripped, his pension seized, his marriage dissolved in a haze of angry, terrified phone calls. Croft had taken everything, right down to his very identity. And tonight, Silas had decided, Croft could have the last thing he possessed, his life. A low, guttural whine, thick with anxiety, broke the suffocating silence of the room. Lying at Silas's feet, a massive, aging German shepherd lifted his head. This was Ghost. His coat, once a deep, rich black and tan, was now heavily peppered with white, especially around his noble, intelligent muzzle and the proud arches of his brows. He was 10 years old, ancient for his breed, and his hips ached with a canine arthritis that made his movements stiff, yet he remained a shadow of the formidable canine partner he had once been, an animal of profound courage and loyalty. Ghost's dark, almond-shaped eyes, unlike his master's, were vibrantly alive and filled with a profound, agonizing understanding. He had been trained to detect drugs, explosives, and human despair. The cabin reeked of the latter. Ghost knew the smell of the gun oil, the metallic tang of the pistol, and the terrifying, absolute stillness of the man he loved. He whined again, a higher-pitched query of distress, and nudged his cold, wet nose against Silas's limp left hand, pushing it, trying to elicit a response. "Go lie down, boy." Silas's voice was a rough scrape of gravel, unused for days. The words held no anger, only a fathomless exhaustion. He didn't have the energy left to reassure the dog, nor the capacity for betrayal by pretending things were okay. Ghost refused. He pushed his head harder under Silas's hand, trying to lift it, demanding a response, demanding the familiar scratch behind the ears that always meant we are safe. All is well. The gesture, an echo of 1,000 better days, of shared patrols in the cruiser, of successful tracks through the deep Montana forest, of quiet evenings after a long shift, sent a sharp, unexpected pang of grief through Silas's numbness. It was the last thread. He had to cut it. He pushed the dog's head away, more forcefully this time, his palm connecting with the animal's snout. Down! Ghost rekeeled, not from the force but from the rejection. He let out a low, mournful whimper, a sound of deep offense and confusion, but he obeyed the command, sinking back to the cold floorboards. His eyes, however, never left Silas. The rejection settled in the room, adding to the cold. Silas turned his gaze back to the dying fire. This was it. The world outside was chaos, but in his hand, he held perfect, simple peace. He raised the Sig Sauer, the weight of it steady, practiced. He thought of his daughter's laugh, a sound he hadn't heard in 2 years, and used the memory to strengthen his resolve. She deserved a better memory of a father, perhaps, but this was the only ending he was capable of writing. He pressed the cold, oiled metal of the barrel against his temple. The blizzard shrieked, providing a final, roaring benediction. He closed his eyes. His thumb found the safety, clicking it off with an audible snick. He took one last shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the smell of whiskey, failure, and cordite. And then a sound that did not belong. Tap, tap, tap. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a tiny, sharp noise lost beneath the oceanic roar of the wind. Silas froze. His entire nervous system, trained for 15 years to catalog the abnormal, screamed to attention. The gun remained at his temple, but his breath hitched. Ghost's head snapped toward the door, a low, rumbling growl starting deep in his chest. Tap, 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 tap. It wasn't the wind. The wind hammered and shrieked. It did not knock. This was a knock, a frantic, weak, desperate percussion, the sound of something small and alive hammering against the dead, frozen wood of his door. Silas remained perfectly still, a ghost trapped between two worlds, the cold steel at his head, and the impossible, desperate sound coming from the storm that was supposed to be his grave. The gun did not waver. The metal remained cold against his temple, a mechanical absolute against the sudden, organic intrusion. Silas Vane was perfectly still, a statue of despair trapped between a decision and a distraction. The sound came again, tap, 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 weak, frantic, and undeniably human. It was a sound of such profound, desperate need that it sliced through his alcohol-fueled fog and the suffocating blanket of his own self-pity. Beside him, Ghost was no longer growling. The sound in his chest had escalated to a strained, threatening bark. His hackles raised. his heavy body tensed and aimed at the door. The dog's panic was real. The threat was real. The sound was real. With a shuddering sigh that felt like it tore something loose in his chest, Silas pulled the Sig Sauer away from his head. The weight of the gun in his hand felt different. A second ago, it had been a key. Now, it was a tool. His training, buried under 2 years of grief and whiskey, surged back to the surface, sharp and unwelcome. He didn't stand. He moved, rolling out of the armchair in a low, fluid motion, his stockinged feet silent on the cold wooden floor. He kept his back to the weak light of the fireplace embers. The gun was now in a two-handed, low-ready grip, muzzle pointed at the floor. He was no longer a suicide. He was a tactical operator in his own home. "Quiet," he rasped at Ghost. The dog immediately silenced, but his body remained rigid, a coiled spring of muscle and teeth. Silas moved to the side of the door, pressing his shoulder against the icy logs of the cabin wall. He listened. The wind shrieked, a solid wall of sound, and beneath it, the knocking, now accompanied by a thin, high-pitched wail that was almost indistinguishable from the storm itself. A baby. Rage, cold and sharp, replaced his despair. What kind of person would be out in this? What kind of monster would bring a baby to his door in a blizzard in the middle of the night? He reached for the deadbolt, his movements economical. He did not care about the person on the other side, but his entire life had been wired to respond to a cry for help. He would face the threat, neutralize it, and then be left alone to finish what he'd started. He flipped the deadbolt. The lock mechanism, frozen, required a painful exertion of force to turn. Then, bracing himself, he yanked the heavy wooden door inward. It was as if the world exploded. The storm blasted into the cabin not as wind, but as a solid entity, a deafening, blinding mass of ice particles and sub-zero air. It ripped the letter from the table, sending it fluttering into the dark corners of the room. It extinguished the last of the embers in the fireplace, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, shifting white of the blizzard outside. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in 5 seconds. Silas, squinting into the vortex, saw nothing. He was 6'3", and his gaze swept the darkness at eye. Level for a threat, a stranded hunter, a desperate motorist, perhaps even one of Croft's men, though he couldn't imagine why. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice sounding thin against the roar. Then he looked down. At first, he thought it was a pile of snow, a drift that had accumulated on his porch. But the drift was moving. It was a child. A small boy, who looked to be about 7 years old, stood on the threshold. He was encased in ice, his thin frame trembling so violently it looked like he might shatter. He wore no winter coat, only a pair of what looked like superhero pajamas under a soaking wet, unzipped hoodie. His face was a terrifying mask of blue-tinged skin, frozen tears, and ice. His small, raw-knuckled fist was raised, poised to knock again. But it was the bundle in his other arm that made Silas's blood run colder than the storm. The boy was clutching a baby, wrapped in a single, sodden pink blanket. The thin, piercing wail Silas had heard was coming from that bundle. The boy's eyes, wide with a terror that went far beyond the cold, locked onto Silas. He saw the tall, bearded silhouette of a man. He saw the gun pointed at the floor. He tried to speak, his frozen lips cracking. "Help! Please!" The words were ghosts of sound. He took one stumbling step forward, collapsing over the threshold and onto the cabin floor. The boy, Mason, didn't let go of the bundle, pulling it tight to his chest with a desperate, protective instinct. He looked up at Silas, his small body convulsing with shivers, and gasped out the last of his strength. "Help us! They're coming!" And then he collapsed, his eyes rolling back, unconsciousness claiming him. The baby, Lily, dislodged from the boy's grip, started to roll onto the floor, but Silas moved, his reflexes finally catching up. He holstered his pistol in the back of his jeans and scooped up the infant in one swift motion, simultaneously using his boot to kick the cabin door shut against the howling white. The sudden silence, broken only by the baby's thin, panicked scream and Ghost's agitated sniffing, was deafening. Silas stood in the wreckage of his suicide attempt, dripping snow, holding a half-frozen, wailing 1-year-old. His cop brain, his canine handler brain, took over completely. He registered the facts. 2 children, hypothermia, severe, malnourished. But it was Ghost who provided the final, horrifying piece of information. The dog was not trying to comfort the children. He was sniffing Mason's sodden hoodie, his nose wrinkled, his tail low and stiff. Ghost was smelling something specific. Silas leaned down, ignoring the wailing in his arms, and ran his hand over the boy's shoulder. His fingers came away wet, but not just with melted snow. It was sticky and dark. Blood. And with it, another scent, faint but unmistakable, clinging to the boy's clothes like a toxic perfume. Cordite, the smell of gunpowder. Silas stared at the dark stain on his fingers. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a stranded family. This was a crime scene, and he had just pulled the only two survivors into his house. The toxic perfume of cordite and the sticky copper smell of blood sharp-focused the room. The world outside, with its impossible, shrieking wind, disappeared. The bottle of whiskey on the table disappeared. The cold metal of the Sig Sauer, now holstered against his back, was no longer an exit, but a weight, a familiar, grounding burden of responsibility. Silas Vane, the man who had been ready to check out, was gone. In his place stood Detective Vane, K-9 unit, working a probable homicide. His first, most pressing duty, secure the witnesses who were half dead. "Ghost, watch," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The dog, despite his injured leg, limped to the front door, sinking down with a pained grunt, but his eyes were alert, his ears pricked, facing the wooden barrier. He was on duty. Silas moved with a speed that belied his 2-year atrophy. The baby, Lily, was still wailing, a thin, reedy scream of terror and cold. He crossed to the fireplace and threw 2 split logs onto the dying embers. They would catch. They had to. He grabbed the thick wool blanket from his own armchair, the one he had planned to die in, and ripped the sodden pink cloth off the infant, wrapping her tightly in the dry wool. Her scream softened almost immediately to hiccuping sobs as she was enveloped in warmth. He placed her on the hearth, close but not too close to the rapidly brightening glow. Next, the boy, Mason. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin a pale, waxy blue. Silas ran his hands over the boy's body with practiced, impersonal efficiency. No broken bones. He checked the blood stain on the hoodie again. It was smeared, not saturated. It wasn't the boy's blood. He was a witness, not a victim, at least not of the violence. Silas gently, quickly, stripped the frozen wet hoodie and pajamas from the boy's limp frame. Beneath, his skin was shockingly cold, like marble. Silas grabbed another blanket from his cot and rolled the boy into it, rubbing his small chest and limbs vigorously, forcing circulation back. "Come on, kid. Stay with me. Wake up." As he worked, a small, brightly colored nylon backpack fell from Mason's shoulder. It was a child's bag, adorned with a cartoonish superhero, its colors abrasive and cheerful in the grim cabin. Silas ignored it, his focus entirely on the boy. "Wake up," he repeated, louder, rubbing the boy's sternum. Mason's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, unfocused, and wide, with a terror so profound it was almost animalistic. He saw the huge, bearded face looming over him, the dark shadow of the dog by the door, and he began to scream, a dry, panicked shriek. "No, no, please don't! I'm sorry!" "Kid, easy." Silas pulled back, raising his hands. "You're safe. You're safe. I'm not them." Ghost let out a low, soft whine from the door, as if to reassure him. The boy's eyes darted from Silas to the dog, then to his sister, who was now quiet by the fire. "Lily," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She's okay," Silas said, keeping his voice calm and low. "She's warm. You're both warm. You're safe. But you have to tell me what happened. Who's coming?" Mason's small body was still trembling, but the shivering was now from shock, not just cold. He looked at the door, as if expecting it to burst open. The men in black," he whispered, tears rolling down his face. "They came to the house. Mom was supposed to be home, but the snow..." He choked on a sob. Dad was yelling. There were loud pops, so many loud pops. Gunshots. Silas's jaw tightened. "What happened then, Mason?" Dad grabbed me. He gave me the bag." The boy's eyes pointed to the superhero backpack on the floor. "He pushed Lily into my arms. He pushed us out the back window. He said, the boy's face crumpled as he recited the words. He said, "Run to the light, Mason. Don't stop. Don't look back. I love you. Run to the light." The boy had run through a blizzard, through miles of forest, carrying his sister, aiming for the only light he could see, Silas's cabin. The bag. Silas's gaze snapped to it. "He gave you the bag." He reached for it, and Mason flinched. "No," Dad said. "He said don't give it to anyone. He said it's the only thing." "I'm not taking it, kid," Silas said gently. "I'm just looking." He unzipped the main compartment. Inside, it was a child's jumble, a small die-cast toy car, a half-eaten granola bar, a single spare diaper, and beneath them, something that did not belong. A black rectangular object encased in a shock-proof rubber shell, an external hard drive. It was modern, expensive, and utterly out of place. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked from the drive to the boy. "What is this, Mason?" "It's Dad's work," Mason whispered. "He was always on his computer. He said this would keep us safe. He said this was the truth." The truth. Silas looked at the drive, then at his own battered, ancient laptop sitting on the desk where his suicide note had been moments before. He walked to the desk, the drive heavy in his hand. He plugged it in. The laptop whirred. A password screen appeared. Encrypted, of course. "It's locked, kid. I can't open it." Mason, now wrapped in his blanket, had crept closer, dragging Ghost by the scruff of his fur for protection. He looked at the screen. "It's Maya," he said quietly. Silas froze. The name hit him like a physical blow. Maya. The name of his own daughter, the daughter he hadn't seen in 2 years. He stared at the boy. "What did you say?" "Maya," Mason repeated. "Maya. It was my sister's name. The one who got sick. Before Lily." A coincidence. A brutal, heartbreaking coincidence. His fingers, trembling for the first time since he'd picked up the gun, typed the 4 letters. He hit enter. Access granted. A single folder appeared on the desktop. It was labeled Croft Exoneration Vein. Silas stopped breathing. He clicked the folder. It opened to reveal a meticulously organized, damning archive. Ledgers of offshore accounts, audio recordings of phone calls, emails between Julian Croft and a network of fixers. It was the entire criminal empire laid bare. It was the truth that had cost Daniel Hayes his life. Then Silas saw the subfolder, the one labeled Vein. He opened it, and there it was. The original, undoctored audio file from his own case, the one that had been edited to frame him. The email chains detailing the fabrication of evidence, the bank transfers. It wasn't just proof of Croft's guilt. It was definitive, undeniable proof of Silas's innocence. Daniel Hayes, a man he'd never met, an accountant at Croft's firm, hadn't just been trying to save himself. He had been trying to save Silas too, and he had died for it. Silas stared at the screen, the blue light illuminating his stunned face. He looked at the 2 children, now huddled together by the fire, Mason's arm protectively around the sleeping baby. He looked at Ghost, who was still standing guard at the door. The men in black weren't just hunting for a hard drive. They were hunting for the only 2 witnesses to a murder, and for the single piece of data that could destroy their boss and exonerate Silas. His life, which he had been so ready to throw away, was suddenly, terribly, no longer his own. It was bound to the 2 sleeping children and the truth burning on his laptop screen. The blue light of the laptop screen painted Silas's stunned face in its cold, clinical glow. The truth, his life, which he had been so ready to throw away, was suddenly, terribly, no longer his own. It was bound to the 2 sleeping children by the fire and the digital ghost of Daniel Hayes burning on his screen. The weight of this realization was heavier than any grief. It was responsibility. It was a mission. The fog of despair and whiskey evaporated, replaced by the arctic clarity of adrenaline and purpose. He was no longer a victim waiting for an end. He was a guardian standing at the beginning of a war. His movements became economical, precise. The man who had fumbled with a whiskey bottle now moved with the lethal grace of a trained operator. First, secure the asset. He didn't copy the files. There was no time, and a copy could be found. He needed the original, the source. He safely ejected the rubber-encased hard drive, the small black rectangle feeling impossibly heavy in his palm. He closed the laptop, plunging the room back into the warm, flickering light of the fire. He looked at Mason, who was watching him, the boy's dark eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Mason," Silas said, his voice low and firm, leaving no room for argument. The boy flinched, but didn't look away. Silas knelt in front of him, bringing himself down to the boy's level. He held out the hard drive. "This," he said, "is the truth your father gave you. This is what he died for." He saw the boy's small face crumple at the word died, but he pushed on. "This is everything. It's the reason the men in black are here. They want it." Mason's gaze locked onto the drive. "I need you to be a soldier, Mason. I need you to be braver than you have ever been. I need you to protect this, and you need to protect your sister." He didn't wait for an answer. He took a small, waterproof plastic bag, part of his old hunting kit, and sealed the drive inside. Then, he gently slipped it into the inside pocket of the boy's superhero pajama top. "You don't let anyone take this. Not even me, unless I use the password. Maya. Do you understand?" Mason, trembling, his small hand instinctively covering the lump in his chest, nodded. The terror was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new, solemn understanding. He had a job, a mission. "Good," Silas said. He gave the boy's shoulder a quick, hard squeeze. "Your second job is to stay by the fire with Lily. You don't move, you don't make a sound. You stay low. Do you understand?" Mason nodded again. Silas turned from the boy, his mind already 3 steps ahead. The cabin was a death trap, a single entry point box of dry wood with too many windows. He had to change the odds. He went to the heavy pine closet by his cot and unlocked it. Inside was his real arsenal. He bypassed the shotgun, grabbing his preferred tool. A lever-action Marlin 30-30 rifle, short, reliable, and powerful enough to stop a threat, even through body armor if he was lucky. He chambered a round, a sharp metallic schlick-schlack that cut through the howl of the wind, and lined extra cartridges up on the table. He checked his Sig Sauer P6, swapped the half-empty magazine for a full one, and tucked 2 spare magazines into the waistband of his jeans. He was armed, now for the fortress. "Ghost," he said. The dog, still posted by the door, looked back, his old eyes sharp. "Hiya, boy. Watch the back." Ghost, understanding the new tone of command, rose with a grunt and limped to the cabin's small kitchen area, positioning himself near the back door. He was covering the second ingress point. Silas turned his attention to the main door. He grabbed the heavy, cracked leather armchair, the one he had planned to die in, and shoved it, grunting, across the floor. He jammed it under the doorknob, the legs scraping against the wood. It wouldn't stop a battering ram, but it would slow them down, make noise, and create a fatal bottleneck. He did the same with a heavy oak chest at the back door. The windows. They were the real problem. 4 large single-pane windows that offered a perfect view in and a perfect target. He was exposed. He moved quickly, killing the single lamp on the table. The only light in the room now was the fireplace, casting long, dancing, and deceptive shadows. This was better. It made him a moving shadow, not a fixed target. He took his position in the darkest corner of the cabin, a spot that gave him a clear line of sight to both the front door and the 2 largest windows, while keeping his own silhouette broken by the darkness. He settled in to wait. The cabin was silent, a bubble of tense anticipation in the midst of the external chaos. The wind shrieked, the fire crackled. The baby, Lily, was fast asleep, her tiny body exhausted, her breathing deep and even. Mason, however, was wide awake. He was huddled on the blanket, his arms wrapped around his knees, his eyes darting from the barricaded door to the dark windows. He was terrified. He was alone. Silas was a dark armed statue in the corner. Then, Mason felt a new presence. Ghost had quietly left his post at the back door, his duty as an alarm secondary to his core K9 programming, protect the pack. He limped over to the hearth. He didn't look at Mason. He simply lay down, with a heavy, pained sigh, positioning his 90-pound body between the children and the front door. He was a living, breathing, fur and muscle barricade. Mason stared at the great, dark animal. He was still afraid of dogs, but this dog had looked at Silas with the same desperate love that Mason had felt for his own father. Ghost, sensing the boy's stare, turned his great graying head. He looked at Mason. The boy's hand, small and trembling, was resting on the blanket. Ghost let out a low, soft whine, not of warning, but of comfort. He leaned his heavy head onto the blanket, his nose almost touching the boy's hand. Mason flinched, then held still. The dog's breathing was slow and steady. A protector. Mason tentatively, slowly, reached out one finger and touched the top of the dog's head. Ghost closed his eyes, accepting the contact. In that moment, Mason's terror didn't disappear, but it found an anchor. He wasn't alone. He had the giant, silent man in the corner, and he had this great, warm, breathing shield at his side. Silas watched the exchange from the darkness, his rifle resting on his knee. He felt nothing, no warmth, no sentiment. It was just data. The boy was secure, his panic contained. His focus was on the door. He was a hunter again. The cabin was his trap. And the men in black, who had murdered Daniel Hayes, who had stolen Silas's life, were the prey. They were coming. He could feel it. The blizzard had hidden the children's tracks, but it wouldn't hide them for long. They knew the cabin was here. They would come. And Silas Vane, a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, would be waiting. The wait was a physical wait. The cabin, once a tomb of despair, was now a tensed muscle, vibrating with the silent anticipation of violence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the baby's soft breathing, and the wind's high-pitched, incessant shriek. Silas, hidden in the darkness, was a creature of pure focus. His rifle was steady. His world had shrunk to the 4 glass squares of the windows and the barricaded front door. Beside the fire, Mason had stopped trembling. He sat with his small back rigid, one hand buried in the thick fur of Ghost's neck, the other protectively covering the hard drive in his chest. The boy and the dog were a single, small island of shared courage. Then, a new sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, a synthetic whine beneath the organic howl of the wind. Silas's head tilted, his eyes narrowing. He had spent years in the Montana wilderness. He knew the sounds of the night, the sounds of the cold. This was not one of them. It was the high-pitched, angry buzz of 2-stroke engines. Snowmobiles. They were close. The sound grew louder, then abruptly died, the pilots cutting their engines to coast the last 100 yards, using the storm as cover. Silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was no longer a void, it was a presence. They were here. Ghost, from his position on the hearth, let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. His head was raised, his black lips curled back from his teeth, his eyes locked on the front window. "Shh," Silas breathed. The command was unnecessary. The dog was a professional. A beat of silence. 1 second. 2. Then, a cone of brilliant, blinding white light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the front of the cabin. A tactical flashlight, powerful enough to pierce the blizzard. It panned across the windows, searching, probing. Silas, deep in the shadows, remained perfectly still, his body dissolving into the darkness of the corner. The beam passed over his position, illuminated the barricaded chair, swept across the fireplace, catching the small, terrified form of Mason, who squeezed his eyes shut, and then clicked off. Another agonizing silence. Then, a voice. It was amplified, harsh, and distorted by the wind, but dripping with a cold, corporate professionalism. "Mr. Hayes, Daniel Hayes, we know you're in there. We have tracked your son's footprints. We don't want to hurt you or the children. We just want the package your son is carrying. Open the door, and we will leave." This was the leader, a man who negotiated before he annihilated. Silas's grip tightened on the rifle. They thought Daniel Hayes was here, or they were just assuming. It didn't matter. He remained silent, his breathing slow and even. The silence was his only answer. The voice called out again, the patience wearing thin. "Mr. Hayes, you have 10 seconds to comply. We are not asking again." Silas slowly raised the rifle, finding a comfortable cheek weld, his sights aimed at the dark center of the window the light had come from. 10 seconds passed. The amplified voice spoke one last word, no longer a negotiation, but an order. Breach. The world exploded. It was not the front door. It was the main window. A man who Silas hadn't seen must have been posted by the wall. He used the butt of his rifle, and the large pane of glass shattered inward, spraying the cabin floor with glittering shards. A deafening roar followed as the storm and the attack became one. Silas didn't wait. He fired the Marlin 30-30. The sound inside the confined cabin was apocalyptic, a physical blow to the ears. The rifle bucked hard against his shoulder. He wasn't aiming at a man. He was aiming at the center of the opening. A high-pitched scream from outside, cut short. A solid thump as a body hit the snow. One down. Contact! Contact! He's armed! He's rear left! The professional calm was gone, replaced by panicked shouting. The night erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the blizzard as automatic weapons fire raked the cabin. Bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls, snapping through the air, thudding into the log beams behind Silas's head. Splinters and dust filled the air. "Get down! Stay down!" Silas roared at Mason. The boy was already flat on the floor, his small body covering Lily's, with Ghost shielding them both. Silas rolled from his corner, the floorboards digging into his back, as his former position was shredded by a sustained burst of fire. He came up on one knee behind a heavy pine table, which he kicked over. It was poor cover, but it was something. "Flank him! Riker, right side! Draw his fire!" the leader yelled. The main volley of fire intensified, forcing Silas to keep his head down. The bullets were chewing the table to pieces. He was pinned, and then he heard it. The sound the leader's command had warned him about. A crunching of snow, not from the front, but from the side. The small kitchen window. He turned, bringing his rifle around, but he was too late. A new figure was there, a shadow against the white. This was Riker. He was a large man, clad in all-black tactical gear, his face a void, obscured by a black balaclava and snow goggles. He had a short-barreled shotgun, and he was raising it, aiming it directly at Silas. Time stopped. Silas knew he wouldn't make the shot. This was it. This was how he died, not by his own hand, but by a shotgun blast, protecting a dead man's children. Then, from the fireplace, came a sound he had not heard in years. It was not a bark. It was not a growl. It was the full-throated, terrifying roar of a K9 engaging a threat. "Ghost! No!" Silas screamed. The dog, his old age and arthritis forgotten, launched himself from the hearth. He was not a 10-year-old dog. He was a 90-pound missile of fur, muscle, and teeth. He crossed the cabin in 2 bounds and, without hesitation, crashed his entire body through the single-pane glass of the kitchen window. The sound of shattering glass was drowned by the dog's roar. Ghost hit Riker square in the chest. The mercenary, shocked by the sudden, airborne attack, yelled in surprise. The shotgun discharged, but the blast went wide, tearing a massive hole in the cabin ceiling instead of hitting Silas. Ghost's jaws, designed for one purpose, snapped shut on the man's arm. Riker screamed in agony, but the victory was short-lived. From the dark tree line, another attacker, one Silas hadn't seen, fired a single, aimed shot. A sharp crack. Ghost yelped, a high-pitched, agonizing sound of pain, and his body went limp, his jaws releasing. Riker, screaming curses, violently kicked the dog off him, sending Ghost tumbling into a snowdrift. The man scrambled back, disappearing into the storm. Silence fell again, heavier and more terrible than before. The gunfire had stopped. Outside in the snow, Ghost was whimpering, a thin, terrified sound. He was trying to get up, his front paws scrambling, but his back leg was useless, leaving a dark, spreading stain on the white snow. "Ghost!" Silas whispered, his heart breaking. He wanted to run out, to get his partner, but he knew it was a trap. And then, the tactical situation became infinitely worse. From the fireplace, a small, high-pitched sound pierced the night, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Mason, who had watched the entire thing, who had seen his new protector sacrifice himself, let out a raw, terrified scream. "Ghost!" Mason's scream, "Ghost!" was a sonic beacon. Cindy beacon, a high-pitched, terrified signal that pinpointed the exact location of the cabin's non-combatants. The gunfire outside had stopped, but this new sound was just as dangerous. "Quiet, Mason! Stay down!" Silas roared, his voice cracking. The tactical advantage of the dark, silent cabin was gone. The attackers now knew exactly where the children were, and they knew Silas would be forced to protect that spot. The amplified voice of the leader cut through the storm again, but this time, all pretense of negotiation was gone. The professionalism was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. "He's got kids by the fireplace. Riker, you hit!" A pained curse from the darkness near the kitchen window was the only answer. "Target the hearth. Flush him out. Light him up." The order was followed by an immediate, terrifying concentration of automatic fire. It was no longer sporadic. It was a sustained, roaring deluge of bullets aimed specifically at the fireplace. Chips of stone and brick exploded inward. The heavy wooden mantelpiece splintered. The bullets were punching through the chimney's weaker points. This was a kill box. Silas, who had been providing cover from the overturned table, knew he had seconds. He couldn't let them pin him down while they shredded the children's only cover. He had to move. He had to make them target him again. "Cover your heads! Don't move!" he yelled at Mason. With a roar of his own, Silas burst from behind the table, firing 2 quick, unaimed shots from the Marlin rifle toward the broken main window, making himself the primary target. It worked. The volley of fire immediately shifted from the fireplace and tracked him. He dove, rolling across the splintered floorboards, bullets snapping at his heels. He slammed hard against the log wall near his desk, the impact knocking the breath from him. He was safe for a second. He was breathing hard, the air thick with gunpowder, dust, and the frigid cold from the shattered windows. He started to push himself back up onto one knee to regain a firing position, but his left arm wouldn't respond. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across his shoulder and chest. He hadn't even felt it. In the chaos of the dive, a bullet had torn through the thin log wall, punching clean through the muscle and soft tissue of his left shoulder. A white-hot, sickening fire bloomed in his arm, followed by a wave of cold numbness. His arm was useless. The Marlin 30-30, now too heavy to operate one-handed, slid from his numb fingers. He was down to his sidearm. The gunfire outside paused. The attackers were reloading, repositioning, or perhaps waiting to see if he was dead. In the sudden quiet, Silas could hear 3 terrible sounds: the high-pitched, agonizing whimpers of Ghost from the snowdrift, the terrified, hiccuping sobs of Mason from the fireplace, and the steady drip, drip, drip of his own blood onto the floorboards. He was severely wounded. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned, and his only partner was bleeding out in the snow. The despair he had felt before, the despair that led him to the gun, returned, but this time it was worse. It wasn't the apathy of giving up. It was the suffocating horror of failing. He was going to fail these children, just as he had failed his own family. Help. He needed help. He fumbled with his right hand for his cell phone in his jeans pocket. He flipped it open. The screen glowed, illuminating his pain-contorted face. No service. The blizzard. Of course. He crawled, dragging his useless arm, toward the wall, just where his landline phone was. The cord was dangling, cut clean. They had cut the line before they ever approached. He was truly, completely alone. He slumped back against the wall, his head hitting the logs. He was bleeding out. He had maybe 30 minutes, an hour, before he lost consciousness. They didn't even have to attack. They could just wait. He looked at the children. Mason was staring at him, his face pale, streaked with tears and soot. The boy watched Silas's blood drip onto the floor. He saw the situation. He saw the hopelessness. And in that moment, seeing the boy's terror, something in Silas's broken mind sparked. A memory, a ghost from his past. Not the failure, but the man he used to be. The K-9 detective, the man with a plan, the go bag. When he was disgraced, when he had packed his life away, he had taken his old K-9 go bag, a heavy green canvas duffel, and thrown it into the one place he never wanted to look again, the cellar. The cellar door was a simple square trapdoor in the floor, right behind where he was sitting. He hadn't opened it in 2 years. It was a cold, spider-filled dirt hole where his father used to store preserves. But in that green bag, he knew, was his old police-issued radio, a heavy, black Motorola. Its battery was likely dead. It was ancient technology. It probably wouldn't get a signal through the storm, but it was all he had. It was the only chance. He tried to stand, to lift the heavy trapdoor. The movement sent a bolt of agony through his shoulder so intense that black spots danced in his vision. He fell back, gritting his teeth against a scream. He couldn't do it. He couldn't lift the door, let alone climb down. And he couldn't leave his post. If he moved, the attackers would see him, would know his position was compromised. He looked at Mason. The boy was still watching him, his sobs quieted by the intensity of the moment. Silas felt a fresh wave of self-loathing. He had to ask the boy. He had to send this 7-year-old child into the dark. "Mason," he rasped, his voice weak. The boy flinched. "Listen to me." Silas used his good hand to point at the trapdoor. "That's the cellar door. I need you to go down there." Mason's eyes went wide with a new, different kind of terror. "No, I can't. There's monsters." "There are no monsters down there. Silas said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old command. "The monsters are all out here. Do you understand me? I am hurt, Mason. I can't go. You have to." He saw the boy's conflict, the paralyzing fear. He had to give him the mission. "There is a green bag, a big green canvas bag in the corner. You'll see it. Inside is a radio, a black radio, like a walkie-talkie. I need it. It's the only way to call for help. It's the only way to save Ghost. And us." The mention of Ghost was the key. The boy's terror was overcome by a flash of desperate hope. "Save Ghost?" "Yes, but you have to be quiet. You have to be a ghost yourself." Silas fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small, cheap plastic flashlight, the one he kept for emergencies. He slid it across the floor. "You crawl, you stay low, you open that door, you climb down, you get the radio, and you come right back. Can you do this for me? Can you do this for Ghost?" Mason looked at the flashlight. He looked at Silas's bleeding shoulder. He looked at the fireplace, where his baby sister was sleeping, oblivious. He looked toward the broken window, where he could still hear the faint, terrible whimpering of his protector. He wiped his nose on his sleeve. His small body was trembling, but he crawled forward and picked up the flashlight. He nodded, his face pale but set. "A green bag," he whispered. "A black radio." "Good boy," Silas breathed, the words tearing at his throat. He used his good arm to brace his Sig Sauer on his knee, aiming it at the darkness beyond the broken window. Go now, and be quiet." Mason took a deep breath, clicked on the small flashlight, and crawled to the heavy wooden trapdoor. He fumbled with the iron ring handle, pulling it up with all his 7-year-old strength. The door groaned open on unused hinges, revealing a square of perfect suffocating blackness that smelled of damp earth and decay. Mason, his small light cutting a weak yellow beam into the abyss, took one last look back at Silas and then disappeared into the hole. The darkness of the cellar swallowed the small yellow beam of Mason's flashlight. Above, the cabin was plunged into a new, heavier silence. Silas, propped against the wall, fought to stay conscious. The only sound was the wind, his own labored breathing, and the steady, metallic drip of his blood onto the floorboards. The pool beneath him was growing tacky. He strained his ears, listening for any sound from below, any sign of the boy. Nothing. Just the suffocating smell of damp earth from the open trapdoor. Outside, the whimpering of his partner had stopped. This new silence was worse. It meant Ghost was either unconscious or dead. Silas squeezed his eyes shut, a fresh wave of failure washing over him. He was failing them all. He used his good hand to press against the wound, a useless gesture. He was dizzy. The fire was dying again, and the room was growing perceptibly colder as the blizzard invaded through the broken windows. "Mason," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. "Hurry!" Then, a new sound from outside. Not gunfire, a sloshing, a chemical smell, sharp and acrid, cut through the cold air, overpowering the scent of gunpowder and pine. Gasoline. "No," Silas breathed. "Riker, the flank! Douse the south wall!" the leader's voice commanded, no longer amplified, but a clear, sharp yell. "We burn the evidence. All of it. Croft pays for the cleanup." They weren't trying to get in anymore. They were executing a scorched earth protocol. They were going to burn the cabin to the ground, with the children, the evidence, and Silas inside. The ticking clock had just become a lit fuse. "Mason!" Silas roared, adrenaline cutting through the fog of blood loss. The trapdoor banged open. Mason scrambled out, his face streaked with dirt and tears, covered in cobwebs. He wasn't just carrying the radio, he was dragging the entire heavy green canvas K9 go bag, a feat of impossible strength for a 7-year-old. He threw it on the floor. "I got it! I got the bag!" he sobbed, crawling quickly back to his sister's side. Silas grabbed the bag with his right hand, ripping the zipper open. Inside, beneath expired ration bars and a dusty trauma kit, was the Motorola XTS 5000. It was a brick of black plastic, a relic. His fingers, clumsy with blood and cold, fumbled with the power knob. He twisted it. A sharp click, and nothing. The battery was dead. Of course it was dead. He stared at it, the final, cruel joke. "No, no, no." He hit the radio against the floor, and then a single, pathetic beep. The low battery light flashed red, a tiny dying ember of hope. It was on. But for how long? He grabbed the shoulder mic, his thumb fumbling for the transmit button. He didn't know if the storm would even let the signal out. He didn't know if anyone was even listening to this channel anymore. He pressed the button. A loud squelch of static filled the room. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," he rasped, his old radio cadence returning instantly. "This is K9 Unit 22 David." He choked on the call sign he hadn't used in 2 years. "I am 1078. Repeat, 1078, officer down. I am under fire. Hostile individuals, multiple, at my 1020, coordinates." He rattled off the GPS coordinates of his own cabin, seared into his memory. 2 children, non-combatant, 1032, man with a gun, multiple men with guns, K9. K9 is 10100. 10100. Officer down, deceased. He was calling his partner dead. "Need immediate backup." The radio's red light flickered and died. The battery was gone. The call was out. But did anyone hear it? The sloshing outside stopped. The amplified voice of the leader boomed again, this time with a note of genuine panic. "He's on the radio! He made the call! Forget the south wall! Breach the front door! Kill him! Kill the kids! Get the drive! And we are gone! Now!" The heavy, methodical thud of a battering ram, or a log, smashed against the front door. The heavy leather armchair shuddered, the wood of the door groaning. 20 miles away, the Whitefish Police Precinct was a small, fluorescent-lit island against the storm. Most of the night shift was stranded on the highways, dealing with pile-ups. In the dispatch center, a single haggard dispatcher named Janice was juggling 3 emergency calls about frozen pipes. Behind her, in the sheriff's office, Sheriff Brody was staring at a mountain of paperwork. Brody was a man in his late 50s, with a face carved from granite and a thick, graying cop mustache. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, and Silas Vane was the blackest mark on his record. Brody had been Silas's training officer, and he had taken Silas's disgrace as a personal insult, a stain on his badge. He was sipping bitter, burnt coffee when the call came in. It wasn't a clean call. It was a scream of static, a ghost of a transmission tearing through the blizzard. "May, K9, 22 David, 1078, under fire, children." Janice, the dispatcher, froze. "Sheriff, did you hear that?" Brody was already out of his chair, standing in the doorway. "What was that?" "Sounded like 22 David. That's not a valid call sign. That was Silas Vane's." Brody's face hardened. "It's a prank. He's drunk. He's finally snapped." "Sheriff," Janice said, her voice trembling, "he said 1078. And children. He gave coordinates." Brody's skepticism was a brick wall. "Vane is a disgrace. He's not an officer. He doesn't get to use that code." Then the radio crackled again, a final, dying transmission. It was just static, but behind the static, Brody heard it. It wasn't a voice. It was the sharp, unmistakable crack, crack, crack of gunfire. Brody stood frozen for 1 second. He hated Silas Vane. He believed Vane was a corrupt, broken man, but 1078 was sacred. It was a holy code, and gunfire was gunfire. "It's a false call, Brody," his deputy said from the hall. "The plows are off the roads. Nothing can get up that mountain." Brody looked at the map, the coordinates. He knew that. Cabin. He looked at the radio, at the falling snow outside the window, at the picture of his own grandkids on his desk. He grabbed his heavy coat. "Janice," he said, his voice a low growl, "scramble every 4x4 unit we have. You call the county. Get me a plow and get it to the base of that access road, now. Deputy, you're with me." "But Sheriff, it's Vane," the deputy protested. "I don't care if it's the devil himself," Brody snarled, checking the load in his shotgun. He called 1078. "We roll." Back at the cabin, the front door exploded. The heavy armchair was thrown aside like a toy as Riker, the massive mercenary, burst through the opening, his shotgun raised. Behind him, 2 other men fanned out, their rifles sweeping the room. "Light 'em up!" Riker bellowed, his eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering firelight. He saw the overturned table. He saw the bloodstain. He saw the cowering child by the fireplace. He saw Silas, slumped against the far wall, raising his Sig Sauer with one shaking, blood-covered hand. Silas fired. The sound was deafening. The bullet went wide. He was too weak. Riker smiled, a cruel souled expression visible beneath his balaclava. He raised his shotgun for the killing shot. Good night, officer. And then the world outside erupted in blue and red. A piercing high-low wail of multiple sirens cut through the storm, so loud it seemed to shake the cabin. Blinding strobes of light flooded the room, turning the chaotic scene into a series of frozen, horrific tableaus. Riker froze. The other two attackers froze. Through the shattered doorway, they could all see it. 2, 3, 4 police SUVs sliding to a stop in the snow, their lights painting the trees red and blue. A new amplified voice boomed over the chaos. It was deeper, angrier, and full of authority. Whitefish PD, drop your weapons! Get your hands in the air, now! Salvation. It had come. Sheriff Brody, his shotgun leveled, stepped out into the blizzard, his face a mask of pure, cold fury. The attackers were trapped. The world compressed into a single frozen moment. 4 sirens wailed, slicing the night air into fragments. Red and blue lights pulsed, turning the snow-blasted cabin into a grotesque flashing disco. Riker, the massive mercenary, stood frozen, his shotgun still raised, his tactical mask reflecting the police lights. The other 2 attackers in the doorway were similarly paralyzed, caught between their target and a wall of flashing blue. I said, drop it now! Sheriff Brody's voice was a roar that carried even over the storm. He stood, feet planted in the snow, his own shotgun leveled not at Riker, but at the man closest to the door. Riker's eyes flicked from Brody to Silas. He saw the wounded, bleeding man slumped against the wall, still stubbornly raising his pistol. He saw the children. He saw the 2 deputies fanning out, creating a kill zone. It was over. With a curse of pure venom, Riker let his shotgun clatter to the wooden floor. The other 2, seeing their leader surrender, dropped their rifles and raised their hands high. On your knees! Hands behind your head! All of you! Brody bellowed, stepping over the threshold, his boots crunching on the glass and shell casings. His eyes swept the scene, never leaving the mercenaries. As his deputies moved in, cuffing the men with practiced, brutal efficiency, Brody's gaze finally landed on the man he had come to despise. Vain, he breathed. His eyes took in the tableau. He saw the man he'd called a disgrace bleeding out against his own wall. He saw the Sig Sauer still clutched in a shaking, blood-soaked hand. He saw the pool of blood beneath him. He saw the overturned table, the shattered windows, the cabin walls chewed to pieces by automatic gunfire. And then he saw the children. Mason, pale and trembling, was still shielding his baby sister by the dying fire. Brody's black and white world, his rigid code of right and wrong, shattered into a million shades of gray. He had come expecting to arrest a drunk. He had found a war zone. Medic! Brody roared over his shoulder. Get the EMTs in here! Officer down! He moved past the mercenaries, his shotgun now lowered, and knelt stiffly beside Silas. Vane? Silas? Can you hear me? Silas's eyes fluttered. He looked at Brody, his gaze unfocused. He didn't see the sheriff. He saw a blue uniform. The drive, Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper. The boy. Mason. Check the boy. His good hand gestured weakly toward Mason. The drive. It's proof. What is he talking about? Brody asked, confused. But then his eyes followed Silas's gesture. He saw Mason, who was clutching the front of his superhero pajamas. Son, are you hurt? Mason just stared, paralyzed. It's okay, kid, Brody said, his gruff voice softening instantly. It's over. As the paramedics rushed in, pushing Brody aside, Silas's head finally lolled to the side. His hand opened. The Sig Sauer thudded softly onto the floor. He was unconscious. We're losing him, one EMT shouted, applying pressure to the gaping wound in Silas's shoulder. BP is crashing. Get me 2 large-bore IVs, now. As the cabin filled with deputies and medics, Brody stood up, his mind reeling. He looked at the chaos. The gasoline canister tipped over near the south wall. They were going to burn them. His eyes fell on the broken kitchen window, the massive bloody paw prints on the sill, and then the dark trail in the snow. Janice, he said into his shoulder mic, I need animal control out here. We have a K9 down. He walked out into the blizzard, following the tracks, and found him. Ghost was lying in a snowdrift, a dark stain spreading beneath him. His breathing was shallow, his legs shattered, but as Brody knelt, the old dog's tail gave a single weak thump. He was alive. Spring came to the Flathead Valley slowly, then all at once. The monster blizzard of that night gave way to a thaw that melted the shoulder-high snowdrifts, revealing a world of impossible green. The mountains exchanged their white armor for a cloak of pine and wildflowers. And in Whitefish, the truth, buried for 2 years, finally came to the light. The hard drive Mason Hayes had carried was a digital atom bomb. Julian Croft was arrested at his Seattle waterfront penthouse 2 days after the siege. The Vane exoneration file, combined with Daniel Hayes's meticulous records, painted a picture so damning that Croft's empire collapsed in 48 hours. The media firestorm was immediate. Silas Vane, the disgraced detective, was suddenly the hero of Whitefish. Silas spent 2 weeks in the hospital. He'd gone into septic shock twice, and the surgeons had to rebuild his entire shoulder, but he pulled through. The first person he saw when he woke up, lucid, was Sheriff Brody, standing awkwardly at the foot of his bed, hat in his hands. "Vain exoneration," Brody had said, his voice rough. I read the file. I was the arresting officer. I testified against you." Silas just stared at him. "I was wrong," Brody said, finally meeting his gaze. "I was wrong. I apologize. Your badge, Silas. It's waiting for you, if you still want it." Silas looked out the window at the mountains for a long moment. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said, his voice scratchy. "But I'm done. I'm done with the badge. I just want to go home." His old home, the cabin, was a wreck, still riddled with bullet holes and soaked in the stench of gasoline. But the town, energized by his story, had rallied. A local contracting crew, led by Brody's deputy, had volunteered their time. They repaired the walls, replaced the windows, and scrubbed the floors. The orphans, Mason and Lily, had been placed in temporary state custody while their parents' tragic fate was confirmed. 6 weeks after the attack, Silas Vane, his arm in a heavy sling, stood before a family court judge. He was a man with no job, a repaired cabin, and the entirety of his disgraced savings. "Mr. Vane," the judge said, "you are a hero, but that doesn't make you a father. Why should I grant you custody of these 2 traumatized children?" Silas looked at Mason and Lily, who were sitting with a social worker. "Your Honor," Silas said, his voice clear, "for 2 years I was a ghost. I was dead. I had nothing to live for. That night, those kids didn't just knock on my door for shelter. They gave me a reason to live. I failed my own family. I won't fail this one. They saved me. I'm just trying to do the same for them." The judge looked at his file, at the glowing recommendation from Sheriff Brody, and the psych evaluation. He looked at Mason, who was staring at Silas. He granted the adoption. 4 months later, it was summer. The cabin was alive. The scent of pine and fresh-cut grass drifted through the new windows. Lily, now walking, toddled on the porch, laughing. Mason was throwing a tennis ball. "Go get it, boy," he yelled. Ghost, his black and tan fur shining in the sun, took off after it. The German shepherd ran with a pronounced, honorable limp. The shattered rear leg had healed, but imperfectly. But he was happy, his tongue lolling. Silas sat on the porch steps, sipping coffee, his shoulder now just a dull ache. He was no longer the hollowed-out ruin. The gaunt lines on his face were gone. His eyes were clear. He was just a man, a father. His phone buzzed. It was a number he hadn't seen in 2 years, his ex-wife, Sarah. He hesitated, then answered. "Silas?" Her voice was hesitant. I saw the news, on TV, what you did. My God, Silas." "Hello, Sarah," he said calmly. I was wrong. About everything. I let Croft's lies." She was crying. "I'm so sorry. Maya, she misses you. She wants to see her dad. The hero." Silas closed his eyes, a weight he hadn't even known he was still carrying finally lifting. "I'd like that, Sarah. I'd like that very much. Tell her I'll see her soon, and I have some people I want her to meet." He hung up and looked out at the yard. Mason had his arms wrapped around Ghost's neck. Lily was clapping her hands. This was his family. This was his second chance. He looked up at the vast, clear Montana sky, and, for the first time in a very long time, Silas Vane smiled. On the longest night of his life, Silas Vane believed he was forgotten. He was ready to quit, but God had a plan. A miracle isn't always a thunderbolt. Sometimes, it's a quiet knock during a storm. When Silas opened the door to those children, he thought he was saving them. In the end, they were the ones who saved him. In our own lives, we all face blizzards, moments where we feel broken, isolated, and convinced all hope is gone. But this story reminds us, even when you think you have nothing left, God is watching. He sends His grace in the most unexpected ways. When you open your heart to someone in need, you may not just be saving them, you may be saving yourself. If this story touched your heart, please share it with one person who needs a reminder that they are not alone. Comment below with a small miracle that changed your life. And subscribe to our channel for more stories of healing and hope. Thank you for watching. May God bless you and keep you, whatever storm you may be facing. Amen.